Hi, I want to start by saying that I don't represent Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't represent the organization. I don't represent any local group. I'm just an alcoholic who recovered using this program, and I have the privilege of working with people who also have a problem with alcohol or drugs. The only difference is many of the people I work with are incarcerated, so making a video for them to be able to watch when they're out on work release or on break is sometimes the best option because we can't always get together because of jail rules. So this first video is just preparation for working the steps. It talks about some of our basic literature, reading material, and what you can expect being part of the program. So what is the big book and what is it actually? Our basic text is the blue book called Alcoholics Anonymous, also known as the big book. In the book there's a preface, 4 forewords or introductions to the book detailing the growth of AA at each reprinting. The first printing in 1939 was 300,000. Whereas the most recent one was over 19.5 million. The first printing in 1939, then 1955, then 1976, and finally 2001. The first 164 pages of the Big Book comprise the official program of recovery containing the steps and how to work them. We have a doctor's opinion who endorsed the program. The first chapter is one of the founders' story, Bill Wilson. Chapter 2 is There is a Solution. We find that we can recover. Chapter 3, more about alcoholism. We learn more about our condition. Chapter 4 is dedicated to agnostics. Even those without a relationship with God can make a start of it if they are just willing to believe. Chapter 5 outlines how it works. It tells us precisely how to proceed. The language at the beginning of this chapter is most often quoted and referenced. Chapter 6 is called Into Action, and we begin to take more courageous steps, looking more introspectively. Chapter 7, Working with Others. We find in the program one of the things we must do right away is give away what's been given to us. Chapter 8 is written to wives, spouses, and family members. It helps everyone involved to learn what our family has been going through. Chapter 9, The Family Afterward. There's a big adjustment period as we experience changes in our lives. Chapter 10 is written to employers. It educates employers about alcoholism. And Chapter 11 is a vision for you. By this point, we're looking ahead at what a lifetime dedicated to sobriety looks like. The second half of the Big Book contains the stories of recovered alcoholics, offered that we might see the program working in people's lives. Each of the 4 versions of the book over time contains slightly different collections of stories. Especially initially, the recovery rate was extremely high. Stories just like ours shed insight on step work and the establishment of a spiritual journey. Let's talk for a second about AA's founders. Low-bottom alcoholic Bill Wilson had been in and out of Dr. Silksworth's hospital several times. He could not stop drinking. Sometimes he'd make it for a period of time, but he always relapsed. The more he learned about alcoholism, specifically that eventually he would die from it, he got creative in exploring ideas as to how the disease could be placed in remission. In the doctor's opinion, it says, quote, in the course of his 3rd treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery, end quote. Dr. Silkworth was open to Bill's passionate attempts to create some type of dialogue in and among his fellow alcoholics. Bill tried and failed and tried again to take active alcoholics under his wing, going so far as to invite them into his home to talk of spiritual awakening. One man even died after destroying Bill's kitchen in an alcoholic rage. Wilson could not give up, though. He kept hearing these amazing stories where overnight the worst of worst alcoholics were just transformed, seemingly instantly. Such examples include Bill's best friend, Ebby Thatcher, who appeared at Bill's home one day as a noticeably different man, psychically changed, saying only to Bill that he had, quote, got religion. An oversimplification, to be sure. In fact, we learn in our text that religion itself is not the answer, nor is self-knowledge alone, meaning knowledge about alcoholism. Many people find many different ways to approach a higher power. For me, it was Jesus Christ. He ended up proving through the process that he was who he says he was, and saved me with his gospel. It's different for others, though. Certainly there's more to it. Ebby had become a member of the Oxford group, whose 6 tenets were the predecessors to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill came around the Oxford group too in his attempts to get sober. Now here's what happened. On a business trip to Akron, Bill found himself outside a hotel bar entertaining dangerous thoughts that meant certain death were he to pick up another drink. So he went to the phone booth, found a church directory, and began cold calling one pastor after another in an attempt to find a town drunk. All he knew was that he needed to talk to someone like him. He had discovered that by speaking to another alcoholic that he felt better, it mitigated cravings, it furthered his spiritual development, and fulfilled the obligation he felt internally to share how he had been relieved of drinking. These are some of the reasons for our meetings. Note that we don't say meetings make us sober. Don't expect a meeting to make you sober. But there is a saying that says, meeting makers make it. Eventually, Bill Wilson was put in touch with Bob Smith, a local doctor who was an alcoholic of the tragic sort. He agreed to give Bill 15 minutes, misunderstanding his overtures as an attempt to influence him. Dr. Bob knew two things that it takes some of us far too long to learn, if we ever do. Self-knowledge about alcoholism is not enough to get sober. The true alcoholics are beyond human aid. Well, they did get together that day, not for 15 minutes though. 6 hours later, the men felt the impact of what they had done by talking. They gained each other's trust instantly. There was something to this. They had something special. They could help others. And yes, it is that simple in some ways. They started right away seeking out men in detox at Akron Hospital. A silly proposition, isn't it, that people would stay sober by getting together and talking? So what is the purpose of the big book? It tells us, quote, to show other alcoholics precisely how we've recovered is the main purpose of this book. That's on page 13 of the foreword of the first edition. Note the word precisely, suggesting that the book offers a specific process for recovery. Secondly, note the word recovered, past tense. After working the steps the first time, developing a spiritual life, and gaining some linear sober time, we no longer have to battle active alcoholism, and we go into a maintenance stage of the steps. What is the big book about? You may think the book's about alcoholism. There may be something of that in the text. However, the book flat out tells us in several places what the book is about. In chapter 4, We Agnostics, page 45, quote, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problems, end quote. In chapter 2, there is a solution, page 29, quote, each individual in their personal stories describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way he established a relationship with God. So what's with all the God talk? It may seem strange that in a book about alcoholism, we are told the purpose of the book has to do with the relationship with a power greater than ourselves. If you're able to read between the lines, you can get your first insight as to how it works. You're here because of alcoholism, yet the literature is telling us we're beyond human aid and that we need a relationship with a higher power that I choose to call God. It may be news to you, but alcohol and drugs were not your problem. They were your solution. And they just stopped working at some point, and now they're killing you. At some point, we drank and drugged because it numbed us out, made us not care, made life more bearable, felt good, and sure, we didn't think that way at the time. Most of the time, we were just staving off being sick. Now we're unable to go on drinking and drugging, but at the same time, we can't stop. What a tragic, painful, frustrating insanity. On this note, the book calls our illness a soul sickness called a spiritual malady. Chapter 4 says, lack of power was our dilemma. That's not hard to verify. We become empty shells of who we used to be, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually bankrupt. We live our daily lives as, quote, restless, irritable, and discontented. Now let's take a look at understanding our illness, the verdict on the alcoholic. What is alcoholism? After the preface and the forewords in the big book, we read the doctor's opinion, one of the most important chapters in our program, which provides the medical estimation of the plan of recovery. As of June 2013, those suffering with alcoholism were given a big boost socially, smashing some of the stigma of the past. The DSM-5, pictured below, which is the medically accepted authority on such matters, classifies chemical dependency, drug abuse and misuse disorder, alcoholism, and addiction as bona fide diseases, hopefully easing our consciousness that we're not moral defects, but also helps us to move public sentiment away from judgmental stereotypes. I've even seen this working in the Secretary's Office of the Senate. Lawmakers are thinking less about incarcerating addicts and more about getting them the help they need. Once classified in the manual, the disease begins to gain more acknowledgement from state and federal bureaucracy as well, and usually increases funding for services and education. Remember that the Big Book was written back in the 1930s at a time when alcoholics were locked in asylums and died. There was no solution, and many ended promising lives in the tragic throes of DTs and clinical insanity. The doctor's opinion is rife with this sense that there was no hope for alcoholics. It ruined lives and baffled everyone around the addict who could not understand what had happened to their husbands, wives, sons, and daughters. Not to mention the addict themselves fully realizing, even more so than family and doctors, that they were abnormal, ill, and dying. Often they would accept this fate and find a meager pit in which to sit and drink and drug until death came. We suffer from a mental obsession combined with a physical allergy, which, when coupled with the phenomenon of craving, drags us into active alcoholism, a disease without a human cure, thus placing us beyond the human aid of any medicine or technology. There is no cure. You must understand, as active alcoholics and addicts, we are beyond human aid. If we're to have any real understanding of the first step, this is the bedrock. There is no way out by human means. We are powerless. Prior to the formation of AA, Dr. Silkworth tells countless stories highlighting how alcoholics and addicts that he dealt with prior to his patients' development of the program, the general opinion seems to be that most alcoholics are doomed. One patient had, quote, hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die, end quote. The phenomenon of craving is the unique component to alcoholics. While a few glasses of wine might satisfy a normal person's craving for Merlot, even if they've thought about it all day, the alcoholic will find his or her desire intensified with any use at all, uncontrollable, leading to a spree where a totally unpredictable amount of alcohol would be consumed. The doc tells us, quote, these men were not drinking to escape, they were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control, end quote. Alcoholism is, quote, chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal, end quote. In my opinion, potentially does not mean it may kill some of us. It means it will eventually kill all those suffering from active alcohol unless placed in remission. However, now, for the first time in human history, a group of 100 men who had experimented and tried this method and found that it worked, wrote, gathered, and exchanged notes, gathered in fellowship, and finally offered the first program for the remission of alcoholism ever in the world.